Today we're going to be drawing organic objects. So in your sketchbooks, you're going to write this as your title. Like normal, we want to put either our name or initials, and then the date at the corner somewhere easy to see. On the sketchbook paper, we're going to end up drawing 3 different fruits, which will represent our organic objects for today. So we're going to have an apple, a pear, and we'll finish off with a lemon. So our process for drawing the bottles and drawing a fruit are going to be kind of similar. There's almost a cylindrical base to an apple. The difference here is we're not going to start with actually drawing the base. We're going to start by drawing an axis. So just going straight from where essentially that core is down the center. On my paper, I'm going to draw the same thing. So this is going to establish the height of this. So if you draw a really long line, you're going to end up with a larger apple. If you draw a small one, you'll end up with a small apple, if you do this correctly. And again, instead of finding the base, we're going to find the widest point of our apple and compare that to the height of it. So the widest point of our apple happens pretty high up. We're also going to use an ellipse shape to help us. Again, if you imagine cutting an apple there, it would kind of have that round shape to it. So if I compare this to how tall it is, it's just a little bit shorter. So I'm going to take the line that I have and maybe make an ellipse that's about that big. Again, towards the top. And it doesn't have to be perfectly even, but this part is pretty even. Now we're going to establish the top and bottom. So the top, if we look at it, is actually slightly tilted. And it's smaller than the widest point. So it's right up against it, just a little smaller and tilted. Then you can see there's a decent amount of space between here and the bottom. And the bottom is pretty small. You can compare, the bottom is about like half of the widest point. So you're going to take about half of the widest point, make an ellipse about that size at the bottom. There. Once you have the top, the center, and the bottom, you're ready to start connecting things. At this point, instead of transition points and adding our defining shapes to that, you can already add them. So if there are any areas that you see that are really round, I like to put those in here. So I can see kind of a circle shape at the top. Again, that's mostly to help me make sure that my lines are as round as they can be. This time, our circle isn't going to be super perfectly symmetrical because our apple isn't perfectly symmetrical. So the lines that we have to connect are going to have different angles to them. One side's a little bit shorter and smoother, the other one kind of points out a little bit and then goes in. All right. Remember to be drawing pretty lightly as you do this. So now that I have the basic shape of this, I'm going to skip and I'm going to do the stem part. So the stem part of my apple, a lot of people will have right out of the top of it. So some people like to add a stem that kind of sticks out. They try to add a leaf, and that kind of looks like a cute little kindergarten apple, but we want to be more specific. So when we get in this stem, you can see this dip that occurs, not at the edge, but a little bit lower than the top. Then our stem has some width to it, so it's not just literally a little toothpick coming out, but it has some volume like the rest of our apple does. So towards the top, we want to establish that little dip that's happening. And we want to get the curve of our stem, but once we have that, we don't want it to look like a little hair, so we want to give it some width. Now I have my stem of the apple. And there is no leaf, so I don't have to do that. At this point, I'm kind of ready to finalize my shape and get in some more details. So I can take a closer look at the actual shape of this apple. You can see that there are some bumps that are occurring, especially at the top and then again towards the bottom. So at the top, I'm going to establish those kind of bumps that are happening. Fix my shape along. And then mimic the ones that are happening down at the bottom as well. Once I have that, I can lighten my lines just like I used to. Clean up things and add any details. So I'm going to go in a little bit darker, but I'm keeping my sketch lines there just like before. And I'm going to draw the finalized kind of shape. I'll include that dip. And all of those ridges. The nice thing about organic objects, especially things like fruits, flowers, is you can approximate. So if your curves aren't exactly the same as the ones that you're seeing, it'll still look like an apple. So it's a little bit more forgiving than a bottle, where if a line looks even a little bit off, suddenly it no longer looks realistic. And there you go. We're going to do that same process with our pear. And so for this, like I said, we're going to start roughly the same. Let me pick a good color. So we're going to establish our axis first, and that will also basically establish the height of this. I sometimes include the stem, sometimes I don't. Just depends on how I'm feeling. After that, we get the widest part, and you can see that the widest part here is towards the bottom. If I compare that to the total height of my axis point, it's really not as tall. So I'm going to shrink that down and kind of towards the bottom, give it a nice wide ellipse. Again, my top is kind of tilted. My axis this time was kind of tilted too. And my bottom is flat. Next, I can connect lines. If I see any shapes that'll kind of help me, then I'm going to put them in. So at the bottom where it's really round, I can put in a circle to help me. And after that, I'm going to connect my lines a little bit better. So on the left side, on the right side, and I'll use that circle to help me. Like before, we want to establish the stem. Again, it doesn't come out of the way top, but you can see this curved area that's at the top of our pear. So in that top portion, you can see this nice curve. And then this stem goes up and then out like that. It's almost like a straw. So if I were to switch colors, you can see that there's a little bit of it that's almost like facing us. So it's going to go up and then out like that, ends with a little ellipse shape. And again, we want to give that some volume. I like to do this specific pear because there's a leaf in it. And oftentimes when I get pears, I get first of all these like very perfectly round shapes. These will come out the top, and then people tend to ignore the way that leaves look, so they'll just give me a perfect little leaf sticking out from the top. You can see that this one curves downwards, so we want to get that to look as accurate as possible, we want this to curve downwards in the same fashion. So up like a hill, then down, and there's just the slightest curve at the end. Now the green part of the leaf doesn't occur there till a little bit later, so there's a little bit of space before you see the leaf part. One side is like really thin, and I'm not really worried about all those spikes yet, but one side is kind of thinner and follows that first line that I made down the middle. The other side goes up and then back down. So bring it up and back down like that. That's the basic shape of it. Now I can start to smooth things out and add any details. First, I'm going to lighten up my sketch. If you want to at this point, you can switch to a darker pencil. And I'm going to go in and finalize some of those lines. Let's deal with the actual shape of my pear first. So again, at the bottom, you see this kind of little bump that's occurring. It's not perfectly smooth. And oftentimes you're going to find fruits that are a little bit lumpier, and that's fine. Now, we're going to get into the stick here that again has just a little bit of width to it, and then it'll eventually get really thin and into our leaf. Now I can start to add those kind of spikes that I see in the leaf with more detail. Going back and forth, kind of unevenly, so don't be afraid to make it uneven. I don't want to see this really even sharp thing happening. The leaf kind of goes in the same direction, so a lot of my spikes are going to be longer. Just take it a little bit at a time. And again, like I said, they can be approximate because this is an organic shape. Another mistake that I'll see is all these little veins and lines. Some people will draw a leaf, again, just go straight down the middle and ruin it with these really dark vein outlines. I don't really see them. I can barely see them. If you want to, you can barely put them in. And notice that they kind of curve with the leaf. So they're not straight and they don't go all the way to the edges, but they curve slightly. And finally, we're going to be dealing with our last fruit, which has a very different axis point than the other ones. So to draw this, instead of our axis being up like this, if we're basing it on the stem, this axis is actually going side to side. So in my drawing, I'll reflect that this is going side to side. You can break this one up into like really simple shapes if you want to. So if I were to do this quickly, this is basically just, you know, an oval. There's essentially a little triangle coming out and a little end bit. So really those basic shapes are going to help, but that's because I know what kind of proportions to put in my basic shapes. If you still aren't comfortable with that, then we still can just break it down like we have been. So we're going to take the widest point, which is right down the center, compare that to how big our fruit is, and our fruit is a little bit longer than it is wide. So there. You can say that this is a transition point, right? So at the end here, we have a transition point before we get into that little itty bitty end. And like I drew before, that's essentially like a triangle. The other end is again very tiny. And in here is essentially an oval shape. So this is going to connect my lines for me. I'll lighten that up. And finalize these lines, really looking at the curves this time. And for any small little details that'll help me. And that's how I would approach drawing fruits. What I'd like to do now is I would like you to write the instructions for how we did this, since the process was a little bit different than before. So on the same paper or on another one, if you don't have any room, you're going to write the instructions for how to draw an organic object, specifically a fruit. There are 8 basic steps that I want to go over. So the first thing that we did was we found the axis, and that's just a line. After the axis, we found the widest point, and we represent that with an oval or an ellipse shape in most cases. There are going to be some special fruit that won't look like that. A star fruit, for example, is a weird one. But for the most part, all of them have very cylindrical or spherical bases. Next, we found the top and the bottom, and we marked those out. Again, probably just 2 ellipses is going to do it fine. Fourth step is we connected the full shape together. So at this point, we looked for defining shapes or transitions. So in our lemon, we had a transition that occurred. Our 5th step is to do the stem, if you see one. Our lemon didn't have one, just had 2 end bits, but some pictures will have them. Another optional thing to draw is leaf or leaves, if you see them. But then we get into smoothing your lines out, which is what you have to do no matter what if you want to get a clean, nice drawing at the end. And finally, you can clean up and add little details if you want to. And those are the steps to how to approach an organic object, again, specifically fruits for today.